Hi, my name is Megan. I'm here in Pasadena, California, and I will be doing the Beginner Basics Embroidery class today. Our workshops here at Remainders Creative Reuse spotlight on invaluable yet underrepresented contribution of women and BIPOC artists from the last 2 centuries. We highlight the artists' work with examples, talk about their lives, and give hands-on studio class directly inspired by their work, showing how female and BIPOC artists have strong voices and continue to be integral to the institution of art. So today, the artists that we're highlighting are the women of the Victorian era. So as we look at the images of some examples of their art, I'll have a few facts about the history here. So the Victorian era is named after Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837 to 1901. She fell in love and she was married to Prince Albert, who sadly died at a young age, and so this left Queen Victoria in mourning for much of her life. She spent the rest of her life trying to hold on to her lover and going to psychic mediums to try to contact him, and this was pretty common pastime in Victorian era, going to psychic mediums. Queen Victoria compulsively collected stuff, memorabilia, flowers, clothing, and furniture. She wasn't the only one collecting memorabilia and fabrics. Women of the time, through the arts of home decor and fashion, were collectors of fabric, flowers, and other mementos. So in parallel with this going on, the industrial age affected the culture and the economy in such a way that people were able to move up economically and socially. So this meant that now people finally had the ultimate luxury, which was leisure time, and more men were going out and being able to afford their family this leisure time. So on the one hand, women had this leisure time, but on the other hand, they might have felt the need to prove that they had this leisure time by spending hours and hours stitching and sewing. And so when you combine the stitching and the collecting, you started to get these amazing, what we call crazy quilts, that were pieces of fabric here and there, little pieces of fabric that cigarette boxes had in them, and that people got from here and there. And sometimes these quilts would be dated, but maybe it was the wedding dates. So looking at the quilts, you might not know when it was made. You just knew that these dates were important, and that sometimes these quilts took forever and ever. So these women felt that they might have need to spend hours and hours stitching just to prove that they had free time. But the hope of this class is to actually relax and chill, and to highlight slow stitching as something that could be an outlet and maybe even something meditative. So with that being said, I would just invite us to take a moment to recenter and to check in. So I'll just do that. If you'd like to close your eyes for a second and take a few deep breaths, I'm gonna do that. So closing our eyes and relaxing the muscles in our face and checking in. Maybe stitching is something we do at the end of a long day, or something we start off in the morning. So we're checking in with the mind and the breath, and taking a moment here to just take a few breaths. And please take as much time as you need to recenter. This can be very helpful when we do creative projects. So as you become ready, whenever you're ready, opening the eyes, and we're gonna get the fabric out. here we go. And let's get our hoop. And if you've never done this before, you take the hoop in your hand and there's a screw. You unwind the screw, becomes two pieces. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the screw part, put it aside for now, and then on the base layer is just the circle part. On top of that, we're gonna put our white piece of linen or whatever fabric you have. It could be tulle, it could be whatever, denim, anything you have. In the kit, we have the white linen. And then you take the screw part and just press it on top of the fabric and on top of the other circle. And ideally, if you can see the weaving in the fabric, you want to make sure it's nice and lined up, or that you're at least aware of the grain of the fabric. And then we're going to tighten the screw as much as you can. The fabric, if it's not super thick, you're going to want to tighten it more. And then from there, we pull the fabric gently on the edges and make this nice and tight. And then we're ready to start. So the first stitch we're going to do is just going to be the running stitch. So we're going to take our piece of chalk, or if you have a marker, a pen, or a pencil. So we've got our pencil, and you can use your ruler if you like. And you can use whatever side of the ruler you like. That's kind of the fun part. I'm going to start with the straight edge here. And it just gives me a line to work off of. If you're using the chalk or a water-soluble pencil, they are going to eventually disappear. So on the one hand, you don't have to worry about that being permanent, but just be careful that it might eventually disappear. So from there, I've got my mark, and I'm getting my needle out, and then I'm choosing a piece of thread. These come in so many colors, which is so fun, and I picked something contrasting. Most everything is going to be contrasting with the white, so that's nice. And we'll cut a length about 12 to 18 inches. I've got my traveler's snips here, which is really convenient on planes or traveling or just laying in bed, honestly. And so you'll notice that this one fiber is made up of 6 little smaller threads. And sometimes you want the full thickness, but a lot of times it's sort of nice to only have 3 threads. So a good way to separate that is by carefully taking 3 threads apart, or if you only want to take 2 off, and just carefully separating these. It wants to start knotting up, but we are doing our best to loosely pull this apart. Another good way, I'll show you again how to separate that, is to start from the middle. I know that sometimes this can be a point where we get caught up. So same thing, I've separated. This time we're starting from the middle. That way it has shorter lengths to go on either side, not get caught up. So I'm pulling it apart, and I'm starting halfway, and then I'm gonna go the other halfway. The reason this is helpful is because the more length you are pulling, the greater chance these are going to get knotted up, which can be really frustrating. Okay, and so I'm setting these aside. These are nice to have. just on hand. So from here, I'm going to take my needle and begin to thread this group of 3 threads through the needle. And you just give it a little, like, you know, kiss it and then try to get these threads through. If I'm really in a pinch, I will grab those little threaders Yeah, I might have to do that. Depending on your needle, it's going to be easier or more challenging. I do think I'm going to have to find a needle threader. So now we can thread the threads through the needle. And I'm using the needle threader. You will find one in your kit. So what we do is we take the diamond and we're pointing it actually through the hole. Wiggle it around and make sure it's in there. And then you've got a nice hole to place these threads into the diamond. And from there, all we have to do is pull this big part. We're actually pinching it near the diamond. It's like an iPhone cord, it like wants to break. But if you give it a nice supporting hold next to the diamond, it's pulls right through, and then we have the threads in the needle. So starting with a running stitch, this is basically a dashed line. So you can tie a knot in the end of this, or you can just leave it loose and try not to pull it through. But let's tie a knot. And then from here, I'm looking at my line and I'm going to just come up at the beginning of the line and pull the threads all the way through. From here, go back in and pull it not too tight, but tight enough to where you've pulled all of the thread length through. And from here, keep going as straight as you can. If you find that the stitches are wide or too short, just keep going, because this is practice. And you'll find that it gets much easier after a few hours. If it's crooked and you end up making a long line of crooked stitches, it still ends up looking interesting just because of the consistency of it. So I would suggest just keep going. Or maybe it's perfectly straight. It's cool too. Something I would suggest would be using your needle as a straight guide. Instead of just like diving in like a fox into a hole, I would suggest using the needle as like a guidance, like an arrow, and then kind of using it as a straight guide to dive into the fabric. And come back up. This is a good time to recheck in with your breath and recheck in with your mind, see where your mind is. It's sort of like a non-judgmental practice here. We're just sort of observing. Are the lines straight? Are they crooked? Am I frustrated? Am I relaxed? And just sort of observing all of that without judgment. In our little slow stitch practice. And going as fast or as slow, as works for you. The stitch can be a great way to put fabrics on top of other fabrics. It is so simple. I'm working on this sort of like backpack thing, and I would probably use a straight stitch like around this circle, or stitching down fabrics or buttons. Like a straight stitch is just a nice simple way to put one fabric on top of the other. So we've got that. And whenever you're ready, we turn it around, and what we're going to do is sort of stitch it down. One way is to just take the needle off here and tie a knot, but I think you can use the needle to tie a knot. So using the needle, we just dive back in and take an anchor stitch. And before you pull all the way through, I'm going to take this loop, and the needle goes back through that. I'll show one more time. This would be sufficient, but I'll show one more time. So I'm diving in, picking up just a couple threads. Instead of pulling all the way through, I'm stopping halfway, and I am just putting the needle back through the circle one more time. And then from there, cutting the threads pretty close to the knot, giving about just a little tail. And then if you notice, we still have thread here, and you can actually just put another knot in this and start again. So putting a knot in this, the thread goes through the circle once and twice. I might cut this little tail off. And start the next line of stitching. So you'll notice that there's little spaces in between the lines of this like larger line. What if you just want one whole line? So the next stitch I'm doing here is going to be the back stitch. So starting at one side of a line, it really doesn't matter if you start from left to right or right to left, whatever is most comfortable for you. And let's put a little anchor stitch in here. So I've come up. I'm going to go back down just a little. And pull our guy all the way through. And I should note that what's going on at the other end of this needle. So we've got this tail, and the needle can move up and down. Oh, for sure. This way? Yeah. Yeah. So I should note what's going on with the tail here. just make sure that the needle stays on the thread, and also make sure that this tail is not getting in the way and not getting like caught. So the needle basically, it has to be at least more than halfway down on the thread, or else this tail is just going to get sewn in there. But it's fine if your needle moves around. Okay, so now we've dove to the wrong side of the fabric and we're coming back. I'll show you the back stitch here. So I traveled about 1/4 inch. I come up and I'm going backwards here to where the other red left off. Backwards. Coming out ahead like 1/4 inch. And going backwards. Basically into the hole that the other thread was, or somewhere near there. And this creates a nice solid line instead of a dashed line. It takes more fabric, it takes more thread because you're going back and forth. And my stitches, I guess I can be a little bit inconsistent here, but the fun thing is it's hard to kind of tell. You can have a little bit of variety if you like, you know, with the stitch lengths, especially with this one because it turns out to be a solid line. And sometimes you even want to do a smaller stitch. For example, if you're going around curves, like this is a button I made and it's with the back stitch. And when I go around these little tiny curves, I'm just doing very small stitches. But if I'm kind of going these longer straightaways, it can be like a longer stitch. Stuff like that. So coming up ahead and going backwards. And feel free to stay on this stitch as long as you like. Whatever stitch you like doing, you can always move on when you're ready. I'm going to go ahead and do one more stitch here and then bring it to the back and put a knot in this because my thread is actually running out. So I'm here at the back of the fabric. I'll put a little anchor stitch at the end of the line, picking up a few threads, diving back through that little arch, and I'm going to do this again. Another anchor stitch, and back through, taking my fingers because the needle came off. It's another moment of improvising. As long as we've got the knot. As long as the functionality is there, the knot, and this isn't gonna come apart, that's all we need. Okay. So now, let's move on to the next stitch. Whenever you're ready, let's go with the chain stitch. I've already got another thread and needle prepared. But if you need to pause and thread another one whenever, of course, be my guest. I'm going to take a moment to sort of show like a really cool way to make a knot. But if this is sort of like a nice technique. It took me a few tries to get this down, but once you get this, it's a really fun way to put a knot in, and it's very easy. So can you see it on the camera?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got my needle and I've got the ends of the thread, and basically you make it so that they're looking at each other eye to eye, and then I take the thread and I place it on top of the needle, again like eye to eye, and with the needle hand I grab the whole thing, and then with the thread hand I'm wrapping this around 1, 2, 3 times, and then I begin to pull the thread so that it's going towards my other hand, and then I pull the pointy edge of the needle in a straight direction as I bring this cluster of loops all the way to the end, and at the end they create a knot. I'll do that one more time. So the ends of the thread looking at the pointy edge of the needle, I put it on top, hold on to it with the needle hand, and then this part of the thread goes 1, 2, 3, kind of smoothly pulling that. That motion kind of creates a little cluster that I can pull this needle through all the way, and then those little loops become a knot at the end. So that's sort of a nice way. And I know from experience, like some people get a little bit caught up on that, so we can of course talk about that in the Zoom meeting. Okay, so let's move on to the chain stitch. I'm going to make another line here. You can make a straight line. We can even make a curvy line. Whatever you fancy. I obviously made both. Okay, so I'm coming up. Once, and I'm on the right side of the fabric. And now I'm going to pick up a few fibers and travel about 1/4 inch. Wrap this thread around before I continue to pull. And then I do the same thing, going into this hole, the hole that I just came out of, which if I were to go all the way back through it, it might even undo what I just did, but I'm going forward, wrap this around, and continue. Oh, and we're getting caught up here. I'll do a few stitches so you can see. Going into this top of the circle, traveling ahead, wrapping this part around, and pulling through. And back. Traveling ahead. This part wraps around the needle before we go through. I'll rotate this so we can see from another angle. The needle dives back into the hole, travels through, could be 1/4 inch, it could be 1/2 inch. the thread that's directly closest to the hole wraps around the front part of the needle, needle comes forward. This is called a chain stitch. And once you kind of get going on this, it could be muscle memory. This sort of stitch makes a really good filler because it's fast and easy. And I'll show you an example. I think I did a lot of chain stitching with the hair, and it kind of filled up a lot of surface space with not too much density, like right here, that sort of thing. Let's see. Another example would be like these sun things. This was done with a really thick, probably 6 or 4 embroidery threads instead of the 3 that we're using here. Oh, and here's another example. Just filler, you know. Lots of white in these lilies. It's supposed to say, do you suppose she's a wildflower? Still a work in progress. Okay. I want to show one more time how you go from anchoring to doing this, because I know that can be a little bit confusing. At the end, I've just dived down at the very tip of the curve here. And I'm going to tie this off, just like the other 2. Create a knot and create a knot. A snip. If you like, you could keep going without snipping this, but I think it tends to keep things neater and tidier if you cut the ends of things. So I'm putting another knot in here. And coming back up. So pretending like we're starting this over, because we are, it dives up. We create an anchor stitch by, it comes up and that's where we start. And then we pick up a few fibers by going back into the hole and traveling a 1/4 inch, and this should work. Looping this around and forward. And from there, it's just the same chain stitch. And whenever you're ready to end the stitch, you kind of just dive back in a little bit ahead. And create the knot on the other side. Okay, so from here, let's do a split stitch. I've got my needle ready. There's a knot in the end. And I'm coming up on this line. I go forward a little bit. And now I'm coming back in the middle of the stitch that I just created, splitting the threads apart, and I go forward a stitch distance. I come back, I split these apart, making sure I'm not catching all this excess fabric. And forward. Coming backwards, splitting this apart. And going forward. I love this stitch because it adds texture and dimension as opposed to this one or this one. It's a little bit more dimensional and it comes off the fabric more. I actually do think that was what was used here, was a split stitch. It does look very similar to the solid line, with the exception that it comes off the fabric more. And if you're using 6 threads instead of I'm using 3 right now, it's going to be much more bulkier and it could be achieving the look that you might be trying to get for flowers or stems or that sort of thing. Once I started embroidery, I noticed that flowers and foliage and trees were sticking out to me more than ever before, because flowers and foliage is such a prominent subject of embroidery. Back in the Victorian ages, there was I think flowerology, and different flowers meant different messages. Like the orange blossom was a huge symbol in Victorian weddings. You know, we still have red roses to express love. But back in the day, you had like giving someone lavender meant distrust, and let's see, if a woman wore snapdragons in her hair, it meant she wasn't interested in meeting men and she didn't want like unsolicited attention from men. Stuff like that. Flowers were such a big part of fashion and culture in the Victorian era. And so maybe ask yourself if there's a flower that inspires you, something that you would hope to recreate. I recently made a embroidered lemon tree, and I found that simplicity was key. I'm just going along this curve. And apparently you don't need like an even number of threads to split, because I'm using a 3-thread line here. And I'm still able to make something that feels like it's being evenly split, even though it's probably like 2 threads on one side and one going off to the other. Okay. Whenever we're ready to come to a stopping point, we'll Take one more dive back at the front of the line. Pull it all the way through to the wrong side of the fabric. And this is what it's looking like on the other side. I'll put my knot here. I'll do another knot. I like to do a couple knots just to feel secure here. These threads aren't going anywhere. So now we've got our dashed line called the running stitch. We've got the back stitch, the chain stitch, and the split stitch. I'd like to do the French knot so that we've got the lines, now we need like the punctuation marks. Okay. So the prereqs for the French knot is that not much, but ideally you want the eye of the needle to be about the same width as the rest of the needle. Most needles will be fine. So let's see how this goes. So I'm just going to put my French knot on this curved line that I've already made. So I'm coming up and I'm going to create an anchor, pick up a few threads. Let's see. And the needle is halfway in, halfway out, picking up a few threads. And from here I'm taking the thread and I'm wrapping it around a few times so that we've created a few loops here. And from here I'm holding the thread with one hand and pulling the needle up. And so you kind of want to tame this group of knots by holding it down with one hand as you pull the thread through. It's actually very similar to like knotting our needle that we did before. And then I'm going to anchor this down by diving down in there. I'm coming up. I've lost my needle. Always rethreading. Okay, we're back. So I'm kind of coming up close to where I already am with the thread, wrapping around. The more times you wrap around, the more thread you're putting on your like little punctuation mark or your little French knot. And as I pull the needle up, I'm trying to hold on to this mass of thread here as best as I can. And here I basically created a knot. And then I'm diving back in to like anchor this down. So I'm only using 2 threads here. So that means my little French knot is actually very like skinny. But if you're using 3 or 4 or more, your French knots are going to be getting bigger. This could be great in flowers, like these sorts of things. Little details, you know, like I think like little green baby's breath sort of thing. Oh yes, okay. Wrapping around. Let's see what happens if I wrap around like 6 times. It's going to be harder to pull through, but here I'm going to try. And stick this down. I think this would be better with like 3 or more threads. We sort of get the idea. Pull up, pull back up, picking a few fibers up, wrap around. And then holding on to this needle while I pull it through. This one might take a little bit of practice, trial and error. And there we have it. We have our French knot. And I have to admit, I'm turning this over. I got caught up in the fabric. Sometimes this happens. It's fine. What I'm gonna do here is cut this in half, release the fabric, and kind of knot this up, secure it. You can improvise. It doesn't have to be couture. We're really just trying to make sure that our art doesn't go anywhere. But yeah, try not to sew in the edges of the fabric. If it helps, you can trim this before you even get started. Get our stuff out of the way. Okay, so the last thing I will show is how to make a flower. And this is a very small example, but it's a rose. The first thing we want to do is draw a circle, a small circle. You could take the chalk or the pencil. Take the little chalk and draw a circle. This circle is probably like a ½ inch in diameter. I could put my finger on it. Not super big, not too small. And now from here, we're actually going to make lines that look like spokes in a bicycle tire. And I want you to create an odd number of lines. So it could be 3 or 5. So for here, I'm gonna do 5. I'm gonna try 5 coming out from the center. The little center dot. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And trying to be nice and even. And you'll see why it matters to do an odd number of like our little bicycle spokes. Okay. So getting our thread ready. This time I'm going to just do a thick length of thread. I might take off one, but this will be easier to get a nice voluminous rose. I gave it a little lick for the threads and try to get this through the needle. Okay. Put my knot in here. And then once we've got the knot and the thread and a little bit of the tail hanging out, just like in the other stitches, we're ready to go. So from here, I'm gonna come up again, just like in the other stitches, but this time I'm coming up in the center of this bicycle wheel, pulling all the way through, and I'm gonna anchor, picking up a few threads. And the first thing I want you to do is outline the bicycle spokes. So coming from the center, out one line, and go back to the center. Create another line, and back up through the center until we've created all of our lines. The thicker thread can be hard to pull through sometimes. Just be a little gentle. And if you're only using 2 or 3 threads for this, it should still work. Trying to make sure that all of these little spokes are about the same tension, the same tightness. And the center doesn't have to be exactly the same each time. It could be off a little bit because the center can be crowded with threads. So we're kind of more or less coming from the center and going out. So now I've got what looks like a star, and from here, I'm just gonna come back through the center one more time. Kind of making sure that these are all the same tightness again. Okay, so from here, we've got our little star and we're in the center. This time, instead of taking the pointy edge of the needle, we're taking the dull edge of the needle and going up and down through these lines. So we're gonna go under, over in a circle around this little bike tire. So going under and kind of go over, or you can think of it as skipping that one, going under the next one, going over or skipping the next one, and going under the next one. Skipping this one, under the next one. Skipping this one, going under this one. Skipping this one, going under this one. And taking our time with this because You want to make sure that the flower stays kind of flat or full like you like it. We're using the dull part of the needle, so nothing is really getting stuck here. We're kind of just threading the thread over and under, creating a fullness and creating the flower. This takes a little practice because you'll notice that some of the little spokes are filling up faster than the others, and that's just a matter of kind of moving the little threads around or squeezing the thread in. But flowers are organic, natural things, so this doesn't have to be perfect. And let's not pull too tight because we want this flower to be somewhat flat and open. And then whenever I'm ready, wherever I stop, I will just dive down to the wrong side of the fabric and create a knot. And if I want, we can use some green to put some little leaves here. So I've put some green in the thread, or some green thread in the needle, put a knot in it, and now let's put a couple little leaves to just cover up the ends of these spokes if we want. And so I'm basically just going to do like a chain stitch. So I went in and I came up and I'm going to come up again by picking up a length of thread. I'm going to wrap this guy around the needle, pull the needle through, gently, and then anchor down that leaf. I'm going to come up over here. Come up again by just picking up a few, like a quarter, half inch, or little length of fabric. Wrap the thread around, pull through, and anchor. Come up over here. If you want, maybe you just want a couple leaves. Pick up some fabric, wrap the thread around the needle, pull the needle through. Little leaf here. And anchor down. Come up over here. Come up again. Okay. And something like that. Come around to the other side. Put a couple knots in. There you have it. A little rose. And so like I said before, embroidery is something that's great to do while traveling or sitting and being still. It can be meditative. If you feel frustrated, I would say take a break and come back. Get some ideas, go outside and look at some flowers or some trees, and then have fun just putting the colors together and your kit together. And over time, it's really fun to collect little pieces of fabric that you love, little memorabilia, and put together a little kit, little with scissors and your thread and your needles, and just take this on the go. So this class and others like it here at Remainders Creative Reuse are made possible by a generous grant from the Pasadena Arts and Culture Commission. Thank you so much. The class following this video is taking place 1 week from today, so please bring your questions, bring comments, and please feel free to share your projects with us. I really look forward to meeting with you and sharing this hobby together. Thank you so much.